5 of those killed in the Hebrew University bombing were U.S. citizens, among them 24-year-old Marla Bennett, who had come from San Diego to Jerusalem to earn a master's degree in Judaic studies. She was killed along with her friend Ben Blutstein while the two sat in the cafeteria. Well, joining us now is Marla's cousin, Jerusalem Post columnist Brian Bloom, who speaks to us from Jerusalem. And Brian, just briefly, take us back to that day 20 years ago when you learned your cousin had been killed.
Sure. We were actually, Marla is from San Diego, and we were actually vacationing in San Diego during that summer. It was during the Intifada, and we actually took 2 months and just needed to be away from Israel. It was just such a horrible time. And my wife and my family, they stayed in San Diego, and I came back because I had to get back to work. I flew via Amsterdam. When I was in Amsterdam, I heard on the news in the taxi that there'd been an attack at Hebrew University. I didn't think anything of it, but when I landed, I got a call from my father-in-law, said, "Did you hear? We can't find Marla. They're looking for her dental record." And then it unfolded from there. And in fact, my wife and family, who were still in San Diego, were there for the funeral, and I was here. So that's kind of the beginning of it.
Right. You wrote a very moving column in the Jerusalem Post this weekend, talking about the kind of person Marla was and the impact she had on so many friends who have chosen to name children after her, variations of her name and her Hebrew name. Talk about that. Sure.
So, I've written about Marla many times over the years. In fact, I started writing back in 2002, right after she died. What we called a blog at the time. I hardly ever use that word anymore. Now we call it a column. Now it's in the Jerusalem Post, but at the time it was just online. And I started writing that because I wanted to show that life in Israel was still normal, that it was, despite everything that happened, including Marla's horrific death, that it was still a normal place. So I started writing about it. But over the years, I just had never written something that really sort of touched people in a way. And I realized suddenly that there were all these babies that were named after Marla. There was Maisie and Meira and Max and Miriam and Maytal and Maddie. And so I got in touch with probably about 25 of the parents who had named their children after Marla, either with an M or a Mem in Hebrew. And then I wrote about it in the column, and it really sort of brought back what Marla was like. And just to give you one small piece, her email address, the end of her email address was @cheerful.com. And that was really what Marla was about. She was such a happy person. She was so inspiring. She would have been an amazing Judaic studies teacher had she finished her studies at Pardes and not
right. And Brian, I think maybe just to explain to people, especially as Jerusalemites, why this bombing in particular was so painful, because the Hebrew University in many ways is a center of coexistence in Jerusalem, in a city that really doesn't have that many of those, and that's why its impact is so lasting.
I think that the Hebrew University is that way, although, there was another horrific attack, the one at the Cafe Hillel on Emek Raphaim Street in southern Jerusalem, which is only about 5 minutes from our house, which is maybe not a place of coexistence, but that almost seemed like, you don't come into my neighborhood. They all were awful. At Moment Cafe, the Haifa, every single attack was horrific. But the one at Hebrew University really touched us, obviously, because Marla was so close to us, and she was what we call a bat bayit. She was in our house all the time. In fact, the summer that she died, she had been borrowing our car because we were in the States. And after she didn't take the car with her to Hebrew University that day, but afterwards, a few weeks later, the police contacted us and said, "We have your keys." We got the keys to our car back, and they were covered in blood. It was awful.
Terrible. She sounds like an extraordinary person. As I mentioned, 5 of the 9, all of them, I'm sure, special people, 5 of the 9 U.S. citizens. And of course, that's very much touched the English-speaking community, certainly in Jerusalem and far beyond that. Brian Bloom, a columnist for the Jerusalem Post, thank you for joining us on The Rundown.